I want to take you through the 10 best books that I read last year. Now, not everything on this list was released last year, but I read it last year. Now, I read a lot, and these were the ones that I enjoyed the most. I'm hoping there'll be something for absolutely everybody. And if your tastes are like mine, then there'll be exactly 10 for you. Now, the first book I want to talk to you about is Mayflies by Andrew O'Hagan. Now, I absolutely loved this book. It was gifted to me at Christmas. It was a book I'd never heard of, and I'm so glad it was given to me. It starts out feeling like the classic coming-of-age story of all about youth, energy, and opportunity. But it shortly shifts to later in the timeline, and we focus on challenges of aging, loss, and wanting to continue your youth past its end date. The book starts with a weekend of chaos, akin to most perfect teenage weekends. And as the story shifts to later in the timeline, the focus turns to one sudden event that the characters have to deal with. I won't give away any spoilers there because it's quite key to the story, but I think O'Hagan does an amazing job of writing really authentically about both youth and middle age, both of which can have the potential to be a little bit cliched. Now, this book is full of quotable lines. One of my favourites is, "They say you know nothing at 18, but there are things you know at 18 that you'll never know again." I really recommend this book. No matter what age you are, it will give you really good insight into two halves of a person. Now, there's lots of books on this list that will be books I read in 2022. Now, I've no doubt that Mayflies will be read again and again and again over the coming years. The next book I want to talk to you about is Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. Now, if 2022 could be summed up in one name, for me, it would be Blake Crouch. I discovered this writer early on in the year and went on to read almost all of his back catalogue. He quickly became one of my favourite writers. And having read so much of him in such a short time, I could see him develop quite quickly as a writer. His early works were okay, but were nowhere near the kind of things he would put out later on in his career. He eventually finds his own style and his own tone, and that is shown perfectly in Dark Matter. The writing itself is simple, accessible, and relatable. Dark Matter takes us on a sci-fi journey with a modern twist. The story is about a physicist named Jason who wakes up one day to find himself in a parallel version of his own life. Kind of like the life that could have been if he'd made a few different decisions at key points. But that is just the beginning, and there are some really cool twists and turns. I absolutely recommend you check this book out. The next book on my list is Stardust by Neil Gaiman. Now, Neil Gaiman is without a doubt one of my favourite writers of all time. I first discovered him as the writer of some awesome comics such as The Sandman, but I went on to absolutely love his back catalogue of novels. If you've never read anything by Gaiman, then you absolutely have to check out some classics like Neverwhere and American Gods. Now, Stardust is kind of similar to Neverwhere in the way that Gaiman writes in a way that is adult and articulate, but about kind of fairy tale themes. Now, this style of writing conjures images of films like Labyrinth in my mind, and that can't be a bad thing. Stardust is the story of a young man called Tristan Thorne who falls in love with a beautiful girl from his village, and in order to win her heart, he sets out into the mysterious land of Fairy to try and find a fallen star. Next comes an amazing story full of magic and mystery, all with a slightly humorous undertone. It's full of magical creatures reminiscent of pre-Tolkien fantasy novels. I absolutely think you will love it. Gaiman's amazing talent for words really shines here, and it does a good job of making a subject matter that could have felt immature really work for an adult audience. It's a great story, and I absolutely recommend you check it out. Now, I listened to this one on Audible, and I really recommend you do the same. Because if there's something that Neil Gaiman is second best at after writing, it is narration. He narrates the book himself and it does it absolutely fantastically. The next book I want to tell you about is called I Will Never See the World Again by Ahmet, Altan. I felt like this book was a really important book to read, particularly in the kind of environment we find ourselves in globally. This is the story of a Turkish writer who found himself in prison for life because he founded and wrote for a satirical newspaper. He wrote and published an article that was found to be denigrating Turkishness, and on came a fairly corrupt sentencing process in which he found himself looking at a life term in prison with no parole. What comes next is a collection of stories and events from his time in prison. They showcase the mental challenges of an intelligent and articulate man coming to term with this kind of proposition. I promise you, this is one of those books that keeps you thinking long after you've finished it. Now, in a positive turn of events, since the book has been released, Ahmet has actually found himself released from prison. So you can now go into the book knowing that it has a happy outcome. My next title is Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishaguro. Now, this book really took me by surprise. Lots of my reading is done late at night as I'm trying to go to sleep, or more likely, failing to go to sleep. And this was a spur of the moment purchase when I had nothing left in my queue and I just needed something to read. I knew nothing about Ishaguro's work and I just liked the look of the cover. I liked the minimalist style of the cover, and it made me think this might be one of those minimalist books, you know, that's all driven by dialogue, it all happens over a kitchen table and leaves you going away thinking you've learnt something new about the human condition. Not really escapism. Well, I was completely wrong, because this is straight up sci-fi. The book tells the story of the eponymous Klara, who is an artificial friend given to Josie, a 14-year-old girl, in a dystopian future where most children are genetically modified or lifted to give them increased intelligence and academic performance. The character of Josie isn't lifted and faces many challenges because of that. We go on to find out much more about Josie's life through the eyes of Klara, and with each chapter the story gets darker and darker. Klara's naive, childlike way of thinking does a really good job of drawing contrast against the darker themes of the story. This book definitely gets the much desired title of Could Have Been a Black Mirror episode, and I'm so glad it wasn't, because Ishaguro nailed it in this form. The next book I want to tell you about is called Pimp by Iceberg Slim. Now this is like nothing else on my list, and I'm so glad I read it. Pimp tells the true story of Iceberg Slim, one of the most notorious pimps from 50s and 60s Chicago and Detroit. If you want a heartwarming and uplifting story, then go and read Stardust from earlier, because this absolutely isn't it. But it will give you a rare insight into a dark and unusual mind. The events that unfold are really surprising, and the prose itself is actually very engaging. It's kind of like a coming-of-age story from the road less travelled. The story starts with Slim as a young man, not really engaged with the usual route of climbing the career ladder. Early on, he encounters an established pimp, and he thinks, I think I should be doing something like that. What follows is at points funny, surprising and harrowing. It's really clear that Slim viewed women as a tool to be used to make money from. He had no regard for their well-being whatsoever. He'd squeeze every bit of life he could out of them before moving on. And he had a real focus about his own reputation and how people perceived him. A story that stuck out for me was quite early on in the book when he was just starting out as a pimp. He had one woman working with him and he wanted to make it seem like he had more. So when she gave him his cut of her earnings, he put it in an envelope and posted it back to himself so that he could pretend it came from another woman. It's full of equally odd and interesting characters from the criminal underworld, and I really think you should take the time to read it. I'm told the story has influenced so much from pop culture over the years. It was originally published back in '67 after Slim finished his first prison sentence. My next book is Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. This is the debut novel from Rooney, who went on to be very well regarded for works such as Normal People. The story follows Frances, a young aspiring writer who, along with her self-obsessed friend Bobby, become friends with an older couple, after the couple sees them performing spoken word live at an event and sees they have a bit of potential. Rooney shows here that even in her debut, she already has the fully formed ability to write conversational dialogue with incredible poetic effect. Her incredibly articulate characters engage in increasingly heated debates that read as true to life as you could hope for. I didn't realise this was Rooney's debut when I picked it up, and it reads like the work of such a matured writer. Similar to Mayflies from earlier, this really focuses on themes of youth and middle age. That seems to be a theme of things I enjoyed last year. I won't delve too far into reasons for that because it might get depressing. My next title is Recursion by Blake Crouch. Now, I said that 2022 was for me the year of Crouch, so it's not a surprise that he's made the list twice. Recursion, whilst not part of any ongoing series, really is in the same kind of vein as Dark Matter, so if you enjoyed one, you've absolutely got to go on and read both. I do think these will be kind of love or hate styles of writing. Lots of you won't love it, but for me it's kind of perfect. Recursion tells the story of a mysterious disease that is beginning to plague humanity, known as false memory syndrome, and it spreads quickly through society. As the lead character begins to investigate further into it, it's clear that some darker force is shaping their perception of reality. The narrative also switches to a second timeline with a female protagonist, a young promising scientist who is working hard to investigate Alzheimer's. She quickly finds herself approached by a visionary billionaire with the promise of much increased funding to really push her work forwards. You can expect some massive sci-fi twists and turns, and I'll let you discover that on your own time. It's a very fast-moving action thriller, but I'm glad that he still takes the time to develop the characters. I really enjoyed this. I hope you go away and read it. The next book on my list might be a surprise to some of you. That is Will by Will Smith. Now, I read this book before his now infamous Oscars controversy, so I viewed the actor potentially differently to how I might now, but it was really interesting read for me and something that came with many surprises. Now, at the time of writing, Will Smith had a very clean-cut image, and he would have been forgiven for releasing a book that kind of helped perpetuate that. But he didn't, and the book is really engaging, very surprising, and in many places he comes out of it looking quite bad. The book is a journey of self-discovery that charts his path to success. It's really interesting, it's full of surprises, and it's packed full of little bits of wisdom that you can take away and use in your own life. You definitely come away from it viewing Will Smith in a different light. He's not always had it easy, and he's definitely made a lot of poor decisions along the way. If you're looking for a bit of inspiration, then this book is pretty good. It does a great job of balancing a really entertaining story with some really motivational takeaways. This is another one that I listen to on Audible, and Will Smith does a really good job of narrating the story. I really think that those kind of books are perfect when they're read by the author. I really think that regardless of what your thoughts are on Will Smith, you should take the opportunity to read this book. Now that brings me to my final book, and I didn't put these in order, so this isn't my first preference, but it was a really good read. That was Fairy Tale by Stephen King. Now, the fact that I read this was almost certainly influenced by how much I enjoyed Stardust by Neil Gaiman, because Fairy Tale is Stephen King's attempt at writing a fairy tale aimed at adults. It tells the tale of young Charlie Reed, who through his own acts of goodwill finds himself handed the keys to a new realm, and a realm that is in desperate need of his help. Now, the prose itself from this book is about as far from the poetic writing that comes from Neil Gaiman's Stardust as you can get, but sometimes a good story is done no harm by simple, straightforward writing. When I first read it, it did frustrate me how long it took for the main character to get to this fantasy world. I think it was about 150 pages and he was still walking around his hometown. But on reflection, I'm kind of glad that it took that long, because it gave Stephen King long enough to really round out the characters and create a protagonist that you could really get behind. When they find themselves get to the fantasy world of Empis, we are finally introduced to the antagonist evils that we're going to have to deal with. It is the classic hero's journey story with some interesting spins put in place. The book is full of Easter eggs and nods to classic stories, at points openly engaging with that fact as the protagonist becomes aware that he's been dropped into a fairy tale world. I really liked it, though I actually would have liked us to delve more into the world of Empis. I wouldn't be opposed to returning to Empis in another story. Maybe Charlie gets a bit older and needs to go back, or another character finds that pathway. Regardless, Fairy Tale itself is well worth you taking the time to read it. So there you have it, that is my list. I hope you enjoyed that and found something you might like to read yourself. Now this year I've set myself the challenge of reading more than I ever have before, and one of the biggest challenges with that is going to be finding things that are worth reading. So I would love it if you could leave me a recommendation. Even better if you can mention why that book is so worth reading. Thank you for watching, goodbye.